This annual lecture honors Dr. Michael Wolff, 1927 to 2016, a co-founder of the Victorian newsletter, later VPR, and the founding president of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. His insight and vision continue to shape the aims of the Society and our individual work as scholars and teachers. We will always be grateful for his leadership and his scholarly legacy. I'm delighted to introduce this year's Wolff lecturer, Alison Chapman, professor of English at the University of Victoria. Dr. Chapman studied at the University of Oxford and the University of Glasgow before her appointment at UVic in 2005. She specializes in 19th century literature and culture, especially Victorian poetry and women's writing, and is a leader in the field of digital humanities. She is the author of 2 monographs, The Afterlife of Christina Rossetti, 2001, and Networking the Nation, British and American Poetry in Italy, 1840 to 70, which came out in 2015, as well as a co-authored book, Rossetti Family Chronology, with Joanna Meacock, which came out in 2007. She has edited 3 essay collections, as well as special issues of Victorian Poetry, 2022, and Modern Language Studies, 2003. Her work has appeared in many journals and edited collections, including recent essays in Victorian poetry and the Edinburgh Companion to Romanticism in the Arts. Dr. Chapman has been the recipient of many awards, including the UVic Faculty Humanities Research Excellence Award and the Boydston Award from the Association for Documentary Editing. She is a recipient of grants from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the British Academy, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the United Kingdom, as well as fellowships from the Armstrong Browning Library and Princeton University Library. Dr. Chapman's current work in progress includes the SSHRC-funded Digital Victorian Periodical Project, DVPP, and a monograph on Victorian poetry, form, and place. She also will soon publish a chapter in 19th century literature and transition, the 1870s, with Cambridge. She has also just been awarded another grant titled Scaling Up, Victorian Periodical Poets, Poetry, and Poetics, which will help her further develop and expand the DVPP. Her lecture today is informed by this recent grant, as well as her chapter in Victorian Verse, The Poetics of Everyday Life, which will be published by Palgrave Macmillan later this year. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alison Chapman.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Alexis. I appreciate it. And can you hear me? Yeah. If that changes, please wave. It is really a huge honor to give the Wolff Lecture, and I'd like to extend my thanks to the conference organizing committee, especially Françoise, as well as to the RSVP president, Fionnuala Dillon, and to you all in the audience for spending your late afternoon with me. I think I speak for us all when I say that today has already been exhilarating and also a little bit exhausting. And all that stands between you and the banquet is me and 15,600 poems. But don't worry, I'm not going to read them all out. But the main, take-home point of my lecture is to ask you all to think big with periodical studies. How do we do that? So my talk concerns the challenges and opportunities of digital projects based on Victorian periodical print. I'm sorry, the clicker's not working. There we go, that's it, all right. So my talk concerns the challenges and opportunities of digital projects based on Victorian periodical print. And I'll be inspired by the wonderful conference theme, Currents in the Periodical Press, to think through this issue with oceanic metaphors, although at times I'll be unapologetically mixing my metaphors too. After all, I'm also inspired by a wonderful comical bicycle poem from Chambers Journal, which I cite in my title, Whizzical, Whirligig, Queer. My talk is based on digital Victorian periodical poetry, or DVPP, a collaborative project I've been working on since 2010 and funded by SSHRC. And a shout out also to my UV colleague and programmer Martin Holmes, as well as to my longest standing graduate RA, Caitlin Fralick, who's encoded over 1,000 poems and 57,000 lines of poetry. And some of her work you'll see here today. I should also say that there's no information or data or stats in this talk that you yourself couldn't do on the site with the search engine and other tools as well. And in fact, part of my goal in this talk is to introduce you to the project. And I won't be giving you a live demo because in my experience, that doesn't usually go well for me, but I'm happy to show you around later in the Q&A. And of course, my other secret goal is to turn you all into periodical poetry converts if you're not already. And if you don't identify as a poetry person, as my students term it, I'm hoping to actually dismantle that distinction between poetry people and non-poetry people. So I'm going to structure my thoughts, as you'll see here, with three parts. Firstly, charting the golden stream. Secondly, flotsam, the filler poem. And thirdly, poetic seriality. So firstly, the golden stream. In his famous 1971 essay, Charting the Golden Stream, the visionary scholar and founder of RSVP, Michael Wolff, readily admits that there is something both overwhelming and overwhelmingly attractive about periodicals research. One can become, I am convinced, a periodicals addict, unquote. Wolff later continues, quote, that working in the periodicals is like wading in a swamp, but that wherever you dive into periodicals, you come up with pearls, unquote. And so, fellow scholars of periodicals, or should I say fellow periodicals addicts, we're all, I'm sure, familiar with the feeling of being almost vertiginously overwhelmed by our material, as if wading through a swamp and with the delight of finding pearls, whether intentionally sought out or serendipitously discovered. Wolff was writing, of course, before digital indexes and surrogates were available, although he optimistically looks forward to the time when, having concentrated all material, he says, in one or two places, the people he terms the electronics people will enable an easy retrieval of information that will, quote, bring us what we want at the press of 3 or 4 buttons, unquote. His vision was for a descriptive as well as analytic Victorian periodicals project, as many of you know, to complement the then in progress and brilliant Wellesley Index, a dream eventually and magnificently realized by the Waterloo Directory. 52 years later, we are in a digital age of superabundancy, with 19th century periodicals research arguably leading digital studies with its embarrassments of riches, indexes, digital editions, and digital surrogates, all variously searchable and many on open access platforms. In the press of a few buttons, as Wolff imagined, we can indeed discover valuable information, difficult or laborious or impossible to retrieve from periodical print material alone. But how can we move through the material, navigate our way through the multiplicity and profusion and sheer messiness of periodical print, recognizing its patterns, but also the resistance to categorization? And so in this talk, I offer the example of navigating periodical poetry at scale as I think about legible and visible periodical print patterns over time, as well as the illegible and the invisible and the frankly unknowable. Digital advances in periodical print allow us to find those pearls more easily in the currents of the golden stream, but these advances also confront us with a great unknowing. In the case of digital Victorian periodical poetry, even the most cursory probe of the data illustrates diversity, profusion, and messiness, as we'll see shortly. And other scholars, of course, have also thought through ways of conceptualizing the trends and the messiness of periodical print culture at scale. Mark Turner, in the Wolff lecture last year and another work as well, argues for a complex and diverse understanding of serial print, based on miscellaneity's dual expansiveness and compression of information. And more recently, Caroline Arscott and Claire Pettit approached the textual and visual form of the 19th century miscellany in terms of the transmission of telegraphic messages as what they term, quote, a pleasing plurality, noise, and the striking and separable entities, signal, unquote, that allows them to articulate the order and disorder, the queer categories, as they term it, of miscellaneity. Other scholars look to print materiality to find patterns of intertwined visual and verbal, generic and material continuity and innovation, such as Sandro Young and Brian Maidment. And recent work on periodical poetry considers a wide-angled approach to uncovering trends and disruptions in print culture, rather than just recovering specific single case studies, as important as that is, especially Alexis Easley, Kirsty Blair, Kaylee Anus, Andrew Hobbs, Linda Hughes, Lorraine Coistra, and the Periodical Poetry Index team, Natalie Houston, Lindsay Lawrence, and April Patrick. My approach to poetry at scale is inspired by all these scholars and others, but I want to press really hard on the question of how poetry might be intrinsic to debates about the concepts of periodicity and modernity. So I will propose that poetry's place in the multiple and competing rhythms of periodicity is both singular and cumulative, junk and treasure, flotsam and current, and signal and noise. And to adapt a claim from Jenny Batchelor's sparkling book on the Ladies magazine, putting poetry at the center of long Victorian periodical culture dramatically shifts our sense of literary history, illuminating how periodical poetry challenges established literary and historical categories. I put it to you that even the category Victorian periodical poetry is really tricksy, as Victorian periodical poetry is not necessarily Victorian, not merely periodical, and often not even recognizable as poetry. To continue the oceanic theme of this conference, a confession, over the last 10 years, DVPP has often given me the feeling that I'm drowning in poems. Currently, 15,600 poems to be exact, as well as 4,000 poets, translators, and illustrators in full runs of 21 periodicals based on print materials in the University of Victoria's wonderful special collections. DVPP combines a poetry index with page images and metadata for each poem, plus attributions where we know of poet, translator, and illustrator, as well as a transcribed and encoded poetry sample of 2,200 poems, and those are marked up for poetic and material features, as we'll see that in a minute, and a personography as well, all interoperable and searchable. And DVPP captures one kind of contribution, of course, from a tiny fraction of Victorian periodicals. And this slide lists the titles with the years in which they published poetry in dark red, and pink indicating years where the title didn't have any poems. But nevertheless, a corpus of this size is a helpful sample project for thinking through the scale of periodicals by approaching one common aspect of its print ecology, the poem. By turns delightful, innovative, skillful, and often frankly second-rate, in fact, as I like to say, so bad they're good, periodical poems were highly profuse and incredibly diverse, and as we all know, until very recently ignored, despite being the highest circulating poetry of the era. Let me give you a quick fact to underline the profusion and diversity. In the encoded poetry sample of 2,200 poems, published across these 21 periodicals from 1820 to 1900, there are an astonishing 348 different rhyme schemes, so 348. While there are some apparently meaningful, if not wholly surprising aspects to the rhyme scheme data, such as the popularity of the AB quatrain rhyme scheme, which is about 15% of our sample, there doesn't appear to be any trend or regularity within the data at this point. And I just want to pause for a moment here to tell you that that dominant rhyme schemes are accessible in the site in 3 ways, in case you'd like to follow up with me as I go along or later. So first of all, you can find these in the Search for Poems page, whereas you'll see here on this slide, highlighted in yellow, there's a filter for searching by rhyme schemes. You start to type your rhyme scheme in and it will come up. And there's also a separate page for each rhyme scheme as well. So this is the ABAB, a partial list of these poems, and you click on the title and it takes you to the poem itself. Click on the author and it takes you to all their poems in our corpus. So this separate index page, as I said, links to all relevant poems. And also, each encoded poem has the rhyme scheme as part of the Poetic Details tab. And I should also just pause here to say there's been a very recent update that you can't see on my slides, which is that if you go to the Rhymes tab of the search page, there is now a whole list of all our rhyme schemes that we have as a dominant rhyme scheme pattern. And that's just happened in the last few days. So I want to give you a kind of glimpse into the poem record pages to show you how you can find your way around the different records through hyperlinks. So this is just a sample poem taken at random. The poem's called The Meeting. This is the poem record page. It's an encoded, transcribed poem. This is the tabs closed. And if you were to click them, you'll see all this information, including on the left-hand side, a way of colorizing the rhyme so you can follow it yourself, and including the dominant rhyme scheme, ABAB. Click on that, takes you to the index page. It's a rabbit hole of research, I warn you. So the majority of the 348 different rhyme schemes are only deployed once. Some rhyme schemes are more popular over the century, but I can't find any obvious trends at the moment, as I mentioned. So for example, while the 1880s are known for experiments in closed poetic forms with tight rhyme schemes, such as the villanelle and the ballade, this isn't currently reflected in the DVPP rhyme schemes for 1880 or the 1880s. And this is a stark reminder that we don't fully understand what kinds of poems and poets Victorians most read, how they are different from our conventional teaching and research canons, based of course on books of original poetry published by single authors. There are also other ways to quickly signal the diversity of the poetry in terms of its poetic and material features. So for example, illustration type and poetic genre. Also kinds of authorship that are all tagged in the corpus as well, so signed, co-authored, pseudonymous, and so on. Sometimes these aspects of periodical poetry in DVPP can tell us things for sure. So let me give you my two favorite examples of things that I've discovered from this site, or things the site tells me. So firstly, the search page for illustrations and decorations. So every poem in the corpus that's illustrated or decorated is tagged and searchable in a variety of ways, revealing widespread and diverse kinds of illustration practices. See, the filter for finding those is highlighted in yellow right there. At a considerable 11% of poems in our corpus are illustrated and decorated. And there's also a search for these poems with more granular filters. That's when you open up the filters, that's what happens. So additionally, the widely varying kinds of illustrative practices are captured in the encoding bar with three different methods. So firstly, we tag illustrations for what we call component, which is what they represent, such as an action or a concept or an object or a setting. And secondly, we tag illustrations for placement on the page, tailpiece, border, rotated, and so on. And thirdly, we tag for type. So is it a portrait, a photograph? Are there multiple illustrations? In addition, each illustration has searchable figure descriptions as well, which you can search in the main search bar. So this tagging offers encyclopedic access to the visual world of Victorian poetry, and trends in illustration practices are certainly discoverable. So for example, you can see by playing around with this site, there's an increasing enmeshment of poem and illustration from the 1880s. So much so in this corpus that the poetry's letterpress becomes visualized as integral to the very decorative page, so that poetry becomes effectively decorated. So that's my first example to tantalize you into the corpus is illustration. We can know so much more now about illustration and the patterns too. And also there is another tool in DVPP that I don't have time to show you, but if you go through tools, the tools bar in the front end, you can find a facsimile browser and you can browse through periodicals and the thumbnails of pages of periodicals and see the trends in layout really clearly right there. So my second example of an interesting thing I discovered to show you that you can find things for sure is that information about periodical authorship practices is discoverable through the metadata. Again, here is in yellow how you can do that, because each poem record is searchable to provide patterns of authorship with a variety of filters like gender, nationality, periodical title, and so on. So one thing that I discovered that really interested me is that for the literary annuals, Forget-Me-Not and The Keepsake, commonly associated with the poetess and a hyper-feminine material format, there are 3 times as many men poets as women poets that we know about publishing in these annuals. So this is based, of course, on the poets that we actually know about and that have been discoverable to us through attribution research, as well as the research of other scholars such as Eileen Curran. But also many poets are perhaps undiscoverable. But even factoring in poems by unknown authors, men poets and their poems far exceed women poets and their poems in literary annuals. Not only might this be surprising for understanding how the literary annual fits into the history of poetry in the 19th century, but it has implications for understanding women's writing too, given that the authorship of women's poetry was so often obscured to readers as well as to us, despite our best efforts. And so how can a history of women's poetry be complete and historically nuanced when it's contingent on a data point, the poet's assigned gender, that's not fully discoverable? So while there are some things that we know for sure in DVPP, there are also things that remain obscure and perhaps also unknowable. And although poetry is my example here, within my particular subset of periodical titles and based on UVic's print collections, I think the same inquiries could be made of other kinds of contributions and other kinds of periodical corpuses as well. So in this wonderful age of our access to the golden stream of 19th century periodicals, we've made remarkable progress in charting the oceanic scale of print and how our field of periodical studies is richly served by a range of stellar digital projects that have transformed the field and its accessibility and discoverability, including the Wellesley and the Waterloo, the Curran Index, 19th Century Serials Edition, Yellow 90s, Periodical Poetry Index, at the Circulating Library, Illustrated Image Analytics, One More Voice, and many more too. But I also invite us to consider the fact that in our understanding of 19th century periodical print, we could all be, methodologically speaking, not waving but drowning in data. And to adapt Paul Fife's memorable phrase, as I mix my metaphors again, this is a feature and not a bug of periodical print. Okay, part 2, Flotsam, the filler poem. Let me now turn to a very common form of poetry, widely considered by Victorian critics as flotsam in the ocean of periodical print, the filler poem. In the very last corner of the very last page of the issue of Chambers Journal for the 4th of June, 1870, readers would find the following unsigned poem. So I am going to read this out for you, but as you'll know as I'm reading it, it's tricky to read out for very good reasons, so forgive me if I stumble. It's a really wonderful poem. To my two-wheeled steed. You are not abyssical, rhyming with physical, whizzical, whirligig, queer. O horse without visible legs which we quizzical, hear of this year, with the ear. Nor are you bicycle, not though a nice iggle girl that I know accents by, rhymes it with icicle, I in surprise giggle, hearing this here with the eye. No, nor yet bicycle. Bless your poor eyes, I call this worse than either or each. A most inadvisable, egotistical liberty, like this, with speech. Trusty two-wheeler of wood and of steel, or iron good-tempered's your frames. That is if the dealer employed an annealer don't let us call bicycles names. You take but a little sweet oil for your victual, no hostler is feed for your feed. To stand me, and if you don't fit ill, you cost but a tittle to stand me instead of a steed. Nor do you get tired, except 'tis desired, if the rings of your wheels give way. Though tired and tired, whenever required, oh horse, you will never say nay. Isn't that remarkable? So this comedic poem questions humorously whether poetic conventions can be adapted for an age of modernity, as the poem strains to fit into the stanzaic constraints of common measure quatrains. This ode to a bicycle, the two-wheeled steed, lists its attributes in comparison to a horse, beginning with how to pronounce and rhyme the word in inventive lines that only just manage to keep the meter turning. Each stanza plays on the poem as read silently and aloud, wondering how to pronounce the rhyme bicycle by sound or sight. So this is how the poem record page looks. The self-conscious poem metatextually implies that it considers itself like the bicycle, whizzical, whirligig, queer, whimsical, quizzical, a mechanical spinning toy, strange and eccentric, giddy, and possibly untrustworthy too. Finding the correct pronunciation of bicycle as a rhyming word involves, quote, a most inadvisable, egotistical liberty like this with speech, unquote. And so what liberties do we take as readers and critics with the poem? I've found that periodical poems often seem to be self-aware about their claims and their place in the culture of serial print. This comical and ingenious poem keeps the whirling wheels of meter spinning, proving that, at a stretch, poetic form inventively and absurdly accommodates inventions, with a knowing joke that this is, in the end, a shared whimsy with the journal's readers. I have more on this poem. Gets better. Although the poem is unsigned, the publisher's ledgers, held at the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, reveals the poet as Eustace Hinton Jones, who was formerly the owner of a successful family business manufacturing coaches in Southampton, of course, a much more familiar form of transportation in 1870 than the bicycle. Jones sold the business in 1866 in order to take up the profession of literature. So what you're seeing there is the person record in DVPP for Hinton Jones. This is the only poem in Chambers' journal and in the whole DVPP corpus that we currently know about by Jones, although he did publish at least one prose contribution in the same issue. There are a great many examples of Chambers poets publishing only one or two poems, as well as prominent examples of poets who publish prolifically in the journal, often disguising their authorship. And for me, the most startling example of this is Dinah Craik, who in all our corpus is the fourth most prolific poet. And from the mid-1840s to the late 1850s, she kept Chambers regularly supplied with poems unsigned and pseudonymous, 122 of them. If you're interested in our kind of top hits of the most prolific poets, there's a card for that in the front page of DVPP. The readers of this 4th of June 1870 poem, of this 4th of June 18th century issue, of Chambers' journal would not, of course, have known who the author was, but they would have known how to place this poem in periodical print as a minor poem or magazine verse, occupying a tight corner of the page layout, a filler poem, in other words. The poem, in fact, alludes knowingly to shared cultures of reading these poems with the whizzical, whirligig, queer, familiar, strange, playful, inventive, calling attention to itself flamboyantly, but also flagging its diminutive minor status. All these attributes are typical, I would like to suggest, of the varied yet profuse periodical poetry genre we call the filler poem. My two-wheeled steed serves as a great example of what kinds of material can be found in serial print, and often superabundantly, and the questions it might raise. Chambers' journal, initially of course Chambers' Edinburgh Journal, regularly featured at least one poem in every issue, in addition to poems included in prose contributions from its founding in 1832. So DVPP indexes both kinds of poems, both the ones that are featured and also the whole poems embedded in prose contributions too, but distinguishes them in the metadata. So from 1844, the second series of Chambers, the format of the featured poems become regularized to settle on the last corner, or almost the last corner, of the last page of each issue. From its launch on the 11th of February 1832 to the end of 1901, that's when we finish our project, Chambers' Journal published an astonishing 3,475 poems. And as one of those 3,475 poems, To My Two-Wheeled Steed shares some generic traits. It's a filler poem, apparently crammed into a corner of the magazine, highlighted by the gaps in the letterpress around the poetic line, yet relegated to the very last tiny space. Second-rate, mere magazine verse, often sentimental and trite, filler poems proliferated, considered flotsam in an oceanic expanse of serial print. But let's rethink filler poems as an attribute of periodical print at scale on its own terms, rather than rescuing these poems as poetry individually worthy of attention, as valuable, in other words, en masse, and as an example of experimenting with scaling up periodical print. Filler poems represent perhaps the most read and most denigrated poetry in the long Victorian era. Published in ephemeral serial print that saturated the literary market, as we know, readers encountered thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these poems that were recognizable through a combination of placement, so squished in a corner generally, as you've seen, also poetic form, generally conventional and generic, and also subject matter, trite and often sentimental. And yet, the reclamation of periodical poetry as literature worthy of discovery is still often framed by critics against the grounds of its original exclusion as mere filler, in opposition to more elevated forms of poetry. Victorian critics were very rude about this poetry, complaining about poetasters that produced magazine verse in opposition to original poetry. Tom Hood the Younger, himself personally responsible for writing as well as publishing many of these kinds of filler poems, declared that they should be eradicated with a mass education of mechanical verse writing to discourage their endless production once poetasters are aware of the difference between verse and poetry. And this essay by Tom Hood, Petty Parnassus, comes in the dark blue for 1871. It's really interesting. Just after the Education Act, people are starting to think about educating people in the writing of verse, as well as the reading of it. Other critics were even more scathing about magazine verse. The main complaint was that there was simply too much of it, and that it wasn't in fact poetry at all. The Saturday Review, which can of course always be relied on for exaggerated denunciations, declares of magazine verse in October 1868 that, quote, nobody thinks of reading it, unquote. Everywhere published, always feeble, apparently never read, although this is almost certainly a gross exaggeration, I'd like to turn to this original charge against these poems to consider the importance of poetry as filler within its specific ephemeral print ecology, which forged for the readers graphic and generic rhythms across issues and titles as a form of seriality, where the diminutive and second-rate filler poem accrued mass and value over time. Chambers' Journal, by so distinctively regularizing the page layout for poems in its weekly issues, provides ample filler poems, and I'll be returning to this title a little later. But the practice of including filler poems was so incredibly widespread that when a periodical treats the poem's mise en page differently, as with Cornhill and the 19th century, which both published their fewer poems with more real estate, more space around giving the whole page, generally speaking, more real estate on the page, it draws a sharp distinction implicitly from magazine verse. So even poets we generally consider canonical could also get this filler poetry treatment. This is a famous example. So once a week readers on the 13th of August 1859 would find Christina Rossetti's The Round Tower at Jhansi at the very bottom of the page after a prose contribution with a misspelled authorial name and a missing stanza. So at this stage in her career, of course, Rossetti was little known. The middle stanza of the full 5-stanza version of this poem, as published in the Goblin Market volume in 1862, may have been admitted by the magazine to fit the poem into its small 2-column space. But that middle stanza also describes the murder-suicide of an English army captain in the Indian uprising, and its omission makes the poem more palatable for the middle-class family once-a-week readership. Crammed into a small space, superficially trite and formally conventional, Rossetti's poem suggests that filler poetry's subjection to the ephemeral mise en page and editorial intervention subsumes textual integrity and authorial agency, disrupting our scholarly conventions of the singularity, wholeness, and uniqueness of the poem and the poet. Once a week, between its launch on the 2nd of July 1859 and its demise in 1880, published 1,118 poems. And while the magazine is known for illustrating poetry with innovative multimedia effects, as Linda Hughes memorably terms it, Rossetti's poem is nonetheless positioned as filler. This is another goodie. Okay, really good one. So another weekly, Dickens's Household Words, also typically positioned poetry as filler. So let me introduce you to the extraordinary poem Long Ago as my next filler poem exhibit, published on the 20th of November 1858, and one of the most formulaic poems I've ever encountered. This poem starts, as you can see in the bottom right corner, but continues into the next page, offering the reader 13 remarkably formulaic stanzas, exposing poetic and graphic conventions with insistent repetitiveness. This Long Ago poem really is dazzlingly formulaic, even by the standards of most filler. The poem gives a catalogue of aspects of the distant past that are recalled to the speaker's mind, with each stanza adumbrating a different thing: glens, fields, streams, lanes, woods, hills, clouds, winds, waves, storms, homes, years. Each stanza, it's a breathless poem, so I have to be breathless when I'm talking about it. So each stanza, except the last, has the exact same structure, with every stanza's final line, except the penultimate stanza, rejoicing in the monorhyme long ago. So 39 of those. The first two stanzas are exemplary and perhaps give you more than enough of the poem. I'll read them out. Oh, the glens of long ago, the willowy glens of long ago, the mossy, rushy, fairy-haunted, misty glens of long ago. Oh, the fields of long ago, the velvet fields of long ago, the verdant, flowery, rainbow-circled, scented fields of long ago. And on it goes. So according to the magazine's office book, the poet was Elizabeth Addy, an Irish Quaker and the wife of George Addy, a shopkeeper on Grafton Street in the commercial centre of Dublin, where he kept a tailor and millinery business. I can't find any record of Addy ever publishing another poem, but of course it can't be ruled out. Reading and writing filler poetry was intrinsic to the formation of serial print community, where readers were also very often contributing writers. So I'm suggesting that many of these occasional poets were actually contributing readers. That's where the evidence seems to lie anyway. Indeed, filler poets, often only discoverable through periodical ledgers, were a mix of occasional poets and more prolific and better known writers, heterogeneously mixed by socioeconomic class and gender, location as well, in a way that often undermines any hard and fast distinction between amateur and professional writer. Household Words published 424 poems during its run from 1850 to 59. Its successor, All the Year Round, also in DVPP, published 1,073 poems during its run from 59 to 1895, almost all of them unsigned. So you can see this sort of similar layout here I'm showing you. Okay. And the magazine Good Words, also briefly a weekly and then a monthly, of course, another incredibly enthusiastic publisher of poems in every single issue, typically set out poems as filler, including 1,389 poems from its launch in 1860 to the end of 1901. So these particular titles that I've been mentioning, Chambers, Once a Week, All the Year Round, Household Words, and Good Words, are just some of the periodicals to repeatedly feature filler poems as a distinctive attribute of their cohesive identity, and together they published over 7,479 poems through the Victorian era. Similarity, heterogeneity, and profusion are the messy but golden trio of periodical poetry. And for all its distinctiveness on the page as a special separate space, might we in fact think of periodical poetry at scale representing something typical of periodical print? Might poetry even be synecdochal of its serial print ecology as a part standing for a whole? Might it be the regular graphic and generic contribution that grounds the receding horizon of heterogeneity and the miscellaneity of serial print? The filler, designed to be cut and pasted by editors and scrapbooked by readers, might also be the figurative glue that holds the entire whizzical, whirligig, queer print culture together. To shift my critical metaphors from the oceanic to the sonic, and borrowing from Claire Pettit, while there's much noise in serial print, these rhythms of form and format, repeated over varying kinds of serial time, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and so on, and across different titles, are a signal. Peppering multiple kinds of serial print, crammed into corners and squeezed into narrow columns, poetry was ubiquitous, sharing features of layout and poetic conventions that were repeated abundantly, establishing what I'm going to call now a major form of serial rhythm, widely prevalent yet roundly denigrated. Filler poetry also paradoxically draws attention to itself as diminutive and trivial, and yet also valuable, self-consciously offering a serial pattern of placement on the page in terms of a small size and specific page location, which discloses a collaborative agency embedded in periodical poetic seriality, with the hidden hands of the editor, sub-editor, compositor, and typesetter, and possibly any illustrators too involved, shaping how readers encounter and understand the poems. Indeed, the filler's formal poetic and print qualities are based on a knowing code of brevity and constriction, ubiquity and genericism. Filler poetry is both tiny and enormous in scale, constructing the complex temporal rhythms of serial time, the multiple forms of start, stop, progress, pause, and the disparate content as a shared reading moment of separation and community. These poems, often amusing and bewildering, disparate and various, asked to be read at scale within their print environment, and indeed the filler poems often gesture self-consciously to their place in such a network of poetics and print. I'm going to give you a few examples of, juicy examples of when this is happening. There are many, many examples of this. This is a wonderful poem too. Filler poems often overtly and metatextually embrace their status as minor, and this seems to be happening increasingly through the century. These metatextual poems are openly and playfully derivative, such as the unsigned stanzas by Shakespeare and Somebody Else from Chambers' 9th of March, 1850, which borrows as its opening stanza the first quatrain of Shakespeare's Sonnet 54, as well as some other rhymes, to transform Shakespeare's sonnet into a 4-quatrain poem addressed to a woman rather than the lovely youth. This derivative poem by Somebody Else, a resonant name that captures the pervasiveness of the filler poem's absent authorship, playfully and overtly depends on, and yet departs from, Shakespeare's sonnet to emphasize its ephemerality, but also how special it is too. This diminutive poetic space is supremely performative. And filler poems also commonly praise the high value of little things. Among many possible examples, I offer the unsigned Little Things, an inaugural poem published in Good Words, which celebrates the religious importance of, quote, the slightest word or deed, unquote, that like a seed will bear fruit in the powerful affect it grows within the receiver. The words little are everywhere in filler poems and feature in many poem titles: Little Things, Little Words, Little Matters, and similar titles abound. And you can get a flavor of this if you just start typing little into the DVPP search for titles search bar, and all the poems of little in it will pop up. I think little works as a code for the performativity of the filler space and develops the earlier 19th century poetical value given to restrictive poems that exceed their formal constraints. Of course, typically this is given to the sonnet, but filler poems take it for themselves too. The culture of filler poems involved a metatextual knowing about their status, a common understanding with the reader that they're both insignificant and also valuable. Verse by E. Matheson from Chambers' Journal, 8th of October 1898, who is a prolific female contributor to Chambers, gives an audacious defence of filler poetry and earned Matheson the sum of £1, 1 shilling. So most Chambers' Journal poems earned from 1832, 10 shillings and 6pence. The speaker defends poems known with a common derogatory term verse, quote, a minor poet's rhyme, unquote, with the easy tuning of meter to conventional lowly things, rather than the sublime wing-soaring of loftier poets. With a simple strain, yet silver measure, the verse writer, this poem claims, celebrates humblest lives. The world is better for his song. Even though these poems are, quote, of little worth, unquote, and the poem's themes, quote, seldom new, unquote, their value, this poem argues, is immeasurable. This poem's familiar form gives a manifesto for minor poetry's value in its derivative, simple, and lowly forms and themes, based on truth and affect. And the versifier is compelled, as a religious imperative, to choose the well-trodden measures of verse rather than the yoke of prose, as the poem puts it. So implicitly, reading these poems cumulatively gives them power to transcend their filler status. Filler poems, little things, last words, performatively claim synecdochal power, transcending their small space and diminutive stature when read. Filler poems repeatedly figure the richness of their poetic agency, especially when acknowledging the poverty of their form and size, as if potentiated by the serial reader. Reading, then, is figured as a deeply social and serial activity, cumulatively building a sense of the value of this mass of filler poems over time, depending on and exceeding the print ephemerality. Filler poems often also refer to their material place on the page in a playful use of spatial form and extremely compressed lines. I give you this example here, Yes, by Nora C. Usher, again from Chambers from 1884, which deploys the filler poem's cataloguing and an interplay of long and short lines to condense the narrative of courtship to fit the graphic space. Here are the first two stanzas. A little rain, the sun again, a shadow. A summer day, some new mown hay, a meadow, a girlish face, a matchless grace and beauty. We spend the day in making hay, sweet duty. The forward driving narrative towards a happy long marriage has humor in the knowing wink of a conventional courtship plot, exaggerated by the very compressed lines, as if this was a generic shared open secret about, quote, a long, long life together, unquote, as the final stanza puts it. Usher's Yes flaunts itself delightfully as filler, self-conscious, performative, knowingly humorous, and super compressed. This exact poetic form and layout is also deployed in at least two later Chambers poems by two different poets that also give a humorously abbreviated courtship narrative, suggesting a shared community of poetic genre as a serial patterning through the issues of this weekly. So I'm making a claim that filler poetry becomes repeatedly reified, self-conscious, generic even, about its formal and graphic place in periodical culture. As a marker of the subgenre's familiarity, the filler poems were satirized towards the end of the century, in particular for their gender politics. The Scottish poet Jessie C. Howden's pseudonymous poem, Long Ago, from Chambers again in 1878, deploys the common hyperregular form, but with ironic innovations to undercut the empty nostalgia of the poetry's investment in romantic love. Howden deploys alternating parenthetical lines to give an ironic alternative narrative to sentimentality, underscored by the repeat rhyme words clings and sings, as you can see from each stanza here. So the poem's offering an alternative narrative of the filler poem's sentimentality through the brackets, through the parenthesis. Just skipping ahead a little bit here. So I think Howden's poem is really remarkable because unless you read it in its kind of print ecology of participating in the filler poem, but also undermining it, you just miss out the critique of filler entirely. And in fact, without understanding the patterning of this ubiquitous filler poems in serial print, poems like Howden's just seem uninteresting, useless, flotsam, sentimental poems, rather than a kind of critique of the very poems they're also performing. Their position on the page, the bottom right-hand corner, the last page of the issue, very common, of course, for periodical poems, indicates their status as filler. And yet this status in this poem too is delightfully highlighted by the poem's proximity to a short adjacent article, the unsigned waste substances, cigar ends, which recounts how cigar butts in Germany are repurposed into snuff and sold for charity, supporting orphan children by providing clothing and a proposed orphanage, demonstrating what can be achieved if a community of cigar smokers works together to repurpose their scraps. Collecting these, quote, small ends, unquote, has surprising beneficial results. The last paragraph, just before Howden's long ago poem, asks, quote, is it not worthwhile to be careful in small things and to save up these usually wasted cigar ends, unquote? Intentional or not, the reader of Chambers' journal is directed to regard the immediately following poem as a small thing too, an insignificant end to the issue that offers its worth collectively. The examples from Chambers, Once a Week, Household Words, All the Year Round, and Good Words represent just a tiny fraction of filler poems. As butt ends of weekly issues and scraps of poetry crammed into tight spaces on the page, filler poems en masse have value. Like cigar butts, reading filler poetry cumulatively within its original print ecology makes valuable flotsam, noise, and waste. Positioned overtly as supremely ephemeral, yet also embedded and connected within an expansive serial print, filler poems are not designed to be read and understood only individually, but rather as a cumulative genre that relies on a reading community, that's consumed poems as a function of serial time. I'm reaching a conclusion. So part 3, currents, poetic seriality. How to detect these patterns in a digital corpus, tuning into page format and poetic formula amid the noise of periodical print. A digital project can, of course, make it easier to chart the currents of the golden stream through metadata and searchability. DVPP, for example, is designed to offer a variety of pathways through the data, as you've seen already in my examples. And so with a few clicks of your buttons, discovering channels through the oceanic material is certainly possible. And yet, this ease of accessibility needs to be set alongside user knowledge of the project's approach to the data, so that the channels are not, in fact, what Michael Wolff calls, quote, a false shortcut, unquote, which he used to term the distractions of wading through the periodicals in swamp-light, his delightful phrase. Firstly, and most fundamentally, the DVPP project team were forced to consider how even to identify a poem. This might seem surprising, given that I've just defined periodical poetry as sharply defined graphic space on the page, and also highly formulaic in the case of the filler poem. But what counts as a poem is not straightforward in our corpus. In periodical print, you'll commonly find poem extracts and epigraphs, poems in multiple languages and dialects, translations into English verse and prose, and also translations of all kinds, including loose, imitated, and false, poems whole and partial in prose contributions, poem captions to illustrations, poems set out as lyrics to musical scores, and much more. Within this wild bibliodiversity, the DVPP team settled on whole entire poems in any literary language within or related to English, including poetry translations into English, as well as entire poems in prose contributions, and with metadata and notes making these distinctions discoverable. By the way, we also had similar problems with tagging illustration and decoration, so what counts as illustrative material? That's another story. And also, interestingly, the titles that gave us the most problem with our taxonomies were the periodicals that began at the beginning of our period, Blackwoods, and at the end, Atalanta. Again, that's another story. But then we encountered another challenge. What counts as a single poem when there are so many kinds of overt relatedness between poems, such as in titles or in numbering, and when poems also came in separate parts or sections. And here's an example. So one example here, Verses for Little Ones in Good Words 1880, with 5 separate parts and 4 illustrations. So what's the poem here? Is it everything or the individual poem parts? For ease of discoverability, we decided to index poems as separate in a sequence when they could obviously be understood to be independent, rather than separate parts of the same poem. But we also decided to relate connected poems together. So you see this in the poem page for this particular poem, Verses for Little Ones, where in the metadata tab, you can discover the related poems and click to them as well. The DVPP taxonomy of related poems, just completed in the last few months, includes a variety of overt poetic relationships, So once we'd found that things were related, we wanted to express how exactly they were related to one another. And this is what we came up with. So we came up with poems included in the same prose contribution. We determined that they were being signaled that they should be read in a relationship. Duplicate poems, poetic replies, multi-part poems, separate linked poems published in a connected overt sequence, such as sonnet sequences, within the same issue. But we also distinguish this from consecutive issues and non-consecutive issues as well, because we're interested in kinds of relatability across serial time. And also poems published consecutively on the same page, which imply readers to consider them together as an implied connection. And these relationships are tagged in a TEI linked group available in the metadata of each poem, as you've seen in the poem record, but also searchable through a filter for related poems on the search page. I've just been outlining how poetry participates in multiple rhythms of seriality at scale, and this encoding taxonomy captures measurable relatedness within and between periodical issues and even separate periodical titles. Out of a corpus of 15,600 poems, 4,753 are overtly related to another poem in diverse ways. It's a remarkable 30%. The implications are profound for understanding kinds of reading fashioned by periodical culture. This is where I want to conclude my talk. Sometimes readers are expected to remember a wide variety of poem relatedness from one issue to the next, such as a sequence published in installments in consecutive issues, and also with interruptions between issues. One of my favorite examples is an 1866 once-a-week monthly cycle of 12 illustrated seasonal poems that punctuate its weekly issues at variable times of the months, with several poets and illustrators sharing similar poetic forms and illustration styles and page layouts. Other times, poetic relatedness is clearly not the intention of the poet, as with poems by different poets sharing the same periodical page, although the implied intertextual conversations can be stunning. This is one of my favorite examples from Macmillan's, January 1866, when the by then well-known Christina Rossetti shares space with the obscure working-class Lancashire poet James Dawson to talk about a signal boost being published under Christina Rossetti. The numbers of sets of different related poems, which of course individually could contain a few or many poems, is also striking. There's a quick table of them here, which suggests a diversity as well as profusion of types of poetic relatedness within and beyond the same issue. In particular, there are more overtly linked poem series in non-consecutive issues than in consecutive issues, suggesting that the serial temporal rhythms of periodical poetry are often irregular. So we've all imagined prose fiction published in installments to be the genre most intrinsically associated with periodical seriality. But this isn't the case if we have a capacious understanding of serial relatedness. And poetry installments in the DVPP corpus anyway, meaning a multi-part poem published in sections such as chapters, are actually quite rare. So in the DVPP corpus, there's just 28 instances of this, of multi-part poems. This sense of poetry's participation in what Claire Pettit identifies as the dominant 19th century form, seriality, is calculable through a sense of scale, but also leads us back to instances of poetic form too. Because in these kinds of relatedness, what links an individual poem to a series of connected poems plays out a major generic dynamic between lyric and narrative, which literary historians often see as central to 19th century poetics. I view the profuse seriality of poems as a diverse practice of narrativizing lyric forms, just as periodical illustration practices also commonly highlight dramatic moments in lyric. Here's another favorite example to conclude with from Woman's World, May Clarissa Gillington's monthly cycle of illustrated pastoral poems, stringing together lyric moments in a seasonal love narrative. So many of us, myself included, have enjoyed diving into digital projects to find one single pearl of a poem from a large corpus. The ability to identify multiple diverse kinds of poetic seriality underscores the need for reorientating ourselves away from diving for single pearls, so that's one poem as evidence, towards thinking of poems as intrinsically part of rich poetry cultures embedded within periodical print ecologies. As James Mussel notes, the digital affords an especial advantage for periodical print, quote, by taking us further away from printed periodicals, digital resources help us understand what it is that the printed periodicals represent, unquote. In our dream of a digital golden stream, for all the immense value of accessibility and discoverability, of charting multiple channels and slipstreams and undercurrents and diving for pearls, perhaps the most important discovery is that by unknowing periodical culture, we begin to understand it anew, if not ever necessarily completely. The example of DVPP, for me, teaches me that by taking us further away from material print and the conventional canon of Victorian poetry, digital metadata and taxonomies capture the distinctiveness of periodical poetry, but also its strangeness, diversity, and complexity. The challenges of categorization that digital projects entail, especially for DVPP, what counts as poetry, as well as how to count poetry, allows us productively to defamiliarize Victorian poetry, even as we begin to recognize its multiple serial rhythms. In other words, by unknowing Victorian periodical poetry, we can make Victorian poetry anew. Similarity, heterogeneity, and profusion, that messy golden trio of periodical poetry, and perhaps also of periodical print itself, might indeed be whizzical, whirligig, queer, in the Victorian sense of those words, playful, strange, puzzling, continuously whirling, and most of all, a sign of shared modernity. Okay, thank you very much.